Welcome everybody to the first episode of Away in the World. We're a new channel and a new podcast that focuses on foreign policy and international relations, but with an Asian twist to it. If you're interested in history, politics, and current events, then fear not, friends, because you're in the right place, especially if Asia is one of your areas of interest. In the weeks, months, and years to come, we plan to bring you a wide range of online content from interviews to debates to discussions with, with policymakers, with journalists, practitioners, and really anyone else with interests similar to ours. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to give us a like, to subscribe to our channel, and most importantly, to tell your friends and your fellow travelers about what we do. We have a very distinguished and dare I say, high profile guest who's been gracious enough to help us out with our first episode. Ms. Suhasini Haidar is the Diplomatic and Strategic Affairs Editor of The Hindu. She has a very distinguished career in both the print and television media in India, an achievement that's a lot harder than it sounds. She used to be an anchor for CNN IBN, which is one of India's leading English news channels. She's extremely well traveled, and her most recent visit to Tibet was to Tibet. Ms. Haidar, firstly, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Neelan, for having me.
Now, let me get the ball rolling. You're, of course, here in Sri Lanka at the moment for an interview with President Rajapaksa and an interactive session with the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies. So, just for me to get the ball rolling, through your well-traveled eyes, how do you see Sri Lanka? And most importantly, how do you see Sri Lanka's role in the geopolitical landscape of South Asia?
Well, I think just to start with, there is no doubt that the changes that we have seen in Sri Lanka in our lifetime are earth shattering. They're huge. When you drive into Colombo, you know that you have been in a country that has seen such strife and yet today is seen at such a high rate of growth, such a high quality of infrastructure that is being built over here, and all the benefits that will accrue to its people. There's also a sense of confidence that you see today in Sri Lanka that perhaps you would not have seen 20 years ago when I first visited in Sri Lanka. When it comes to Sri Lanka's position in the world, it is more and more attractive. Because remember, you are not just at the tip of India and all that goes with the Indian subcontinent and the connectivity there. Sri Lanka has opened out to its Southeast Asian neighbors across the seas with the port in Hambantota and with the idea that it is now, world-class infrastructure for marine commerce and the rest of that. So what we're seeing is Sri Lanka emerging in a way that has been nothing but positive. What will hold Sri Lanka back is some of the if you like contradictions of the last few years when it comes to the entire reconciliation process. There have been many who have hoped that reconciliation process would be a lot quicker. There are many in India that are still hopeful that the process of devolution and all the rest will take place faster. But there is no denying the kind of growth Sri Lanka has seen will benefit each and every citizen.
If I could just play the devil's advocate for a moment now, on this issue of reconciliation, of course, the Sri Lankan government's position is that when you look at things like demining, resettling the displaced, rehabilitating ex-combatants, that they are years ahead of any comparable example that really anyone can provide. In what sense do you think this has been a bit of a disappointment to people?
Perhaps the expectations were too high to begin with. But there is no question that if anyone can do it, it is Sri Lanka. Because here you are looking at a small island. You are not a large country with the problems that a large country and its population would bring with it. It's a country with a history of diversity, of diverse cultures. And the fact is, it was a nation that really saw so much violence that just the end of that violence has renewed everything for the country. So you're right that no country has perhaps done as much in the last few years. The truth is, though, that conflicts today play out on a much larger canvas. The world watches very closely and particularly looks for places where they think that there have been contraventions, violations, in particular of what they see as international law. This is not to say that Sri Lanka is guilty before, is guilty in a way that the truth is that nobody can take away from Sri Lanka the achievement that they have been the single country to have ended a terror group. There are very few parallels in the world and in history to what they were able to achieve when it came to the LTT. Even so, the questions that remain about the last few months of that war will hang over unless there is a perceptible, if you like, shift in the way Sri Lanka portrays itself in the world. I have no doubt that Sri Lanka will do it. I have no doubt that Sri Lanka can do it as well. But that process is something that will have to be gone through before that entire, as I said, the thing that holds Sri Lanka back, in a sense, it ceases to have a reason to be.
Now, just on the conflict and the international arena itself, India, I've always seen India as a country that's faced a lot of the same security challenges. I mean, India has always been plagued with insurgencies from Khalistan to the northeast. And of course, if India does successfully annihilate an insurgency, they would be faced with a lot of the same international criticism that Sri Lanka is now facing. Do you find India's official position confusing? Because India must, of course, keep in mind that this could happen to it at any time.
Absolutely, and I think it's at the top of India's mind when India decided to vote this year against a resolution that essentially asked for an international inquiry into what is already being investigated inside Sri Lanka. It was very clear that it would have been very difficult for India to have voted any other way. In fact, many had almost thought that given the seriousness of this international effort to somehow put an agency from the outside on Sri Lanka to impose that India would even have voted against the resolution altogether. What you're saying is absolutely true, that India faces its own challenges when it comes to insurgencies, when it comes to violence, and could face the same kind of international scrutiny. But that is not to say that every country does not have to go through a process of reconciliation. India needs a process of reconciliation when it comes to Kashmir, when it comes to the Northeast, just as Sri Lanka needs to walk that. Because eventually what we know is that the absence of violence is not peace. It is the presence of justice that eventually becomes the precursor for peace. It was very heartening to see in Sri Lanka's own explanation at the UNHRC a few days ago that the involvement in the process of the South African Vice President Cyril Ramaphosa and the kind of advice that he has also given in that process, because it means that there is a process underway inside Sri Lanka to work towards that reconciliation. Is that process over yet? I don't think so.
And in terms of the pressure from Tamil Nadu, now, do you see this being as big a factor as some people playing it up to be? Because one of the most baffling things that I've always found was that regardless of what people say about there being a lot of public support for the separatist movement in Tamil Nadu, it's still a fact that not a single one of those political parties that had an exclusively separatist agenda has ever met any kind of political success.
Absolutely, and you might find that about extremists everywhere, that eventually politically they don't do as well as the kind of noise that they are able to create. Look, I would agree with you. Remember that Tamil Nadu is also a victim of terrorism. India lost its prime minister to the LTT, to a suicide bomb inside Tamil Nadu, and I don't think that's something people get over easily. I also think that the bluff of these years, for those years where there was threats of large-scale violence on the streets in Tamil Nadu, if India had in any way voted along with Sri Lanka, seems to have been proven by the fact that when India decided to abstain from the vote, which would have actually put into place the things that the politicians there seem to be asking for, there was absolutely no reaction to that. Did that mean that only when politicians stir up those passions and work, those protests, that the actual position on the ground is very different from the political atmosphere that they portray? There is no question that there are concerns about human rights violations, but I would say there are concerns about human rights violations everywhere. And given that Sri Lanka was able to get the LTT, to finish the LTT the way they were able to do it, it would really follow that if there is a country that can complete that process of reconciliation as well, of winning the war and then winning the peace, as I believe, I think that would be Sri Lanka.
And if you could just project into the future for our listeners, do you foresee any drastic change in the way that India deals with Sri Lanka under Narendra Modi as opposed to the UPA regimes?
Look, I think the drastic change came actually pre-Narendra Modi, when India decided to move away from its policy of voting against Sri Lanka at an international forum. Narendra Modi has made it very clear what the tenets of his foreign policy are going to be. Whether he follows through on them will be interesting to watch, but the neighborhood is important for him. Equally, by meeting both President Rajapaksa right at the beginning of his tenure, and then a few months later meeting leaders from the north and east provinces of the TNA alliance, what he's making clear is that his interest in Sri Lanka and of a lasting peace here is also very strong.
But some saw that as a betrayal, though, when Prime Minister Modi met up with the TNA. Some hawks here did see that as a bit of a betrayal on the side of India.
I think no meeting is actually a betrayal on its own. I think what is the substance of that meeting is important. From every kind of account, what seems to have been the thrust of Mr. Modi's meeting with the TNA alliance was to say that the dialogue process must be restarted. What conditions that happens under, clearly that's not something India can decide. That is going to happen at that level. But I've always held that in order for the Delhi-Colombo dialogue to work, you are going to have in that 5 dialogues, and that is the Delhi-Colombo dialogue, the dialogue between Colombo and Jaffna and Delhi and Chennai. That means between those centers and their states, both of which have been fractious relations over the last few years. And then the cross as well. Delhi and Jaffna are historical entities. They are going to have that connection. And similarly, a dialogue must be built, according to me, between Colombo and Chennai. And that has been woefully lacking over the last few years.
Would that not be seen as or could that not be seen rather as an interference in Sri Lanka's affairs? A statement like that from Prime Minister Modi?
I think the truth is that India is an integral part of the situation inside Sri Lanka. If you want to speak about interference, how many years back are we going to go? Are we going to go back 30 years? Are we going to go back to the IPKF time? Are we going to go back to the time that India helped Sri Lanka to, in fact, defeat the LTT by producing a naval blockade? That too could be construed as interference inside Sri Lanka's affairs. So India has always had an interest. It is a legitimate interest in many ways. And just because of also, as I said, the cultural ties that bind the north and east to Tamil Nadu, you're always going to see that presence. The question is, can we be honest now? Can India and Sri Lanka be honest about the nature of that dialogue? And can we actually see, as I said, the capitals, not just of the centers, but the capitals of the states also all being interlinked? I think that is the only way forward.
As a last question, I'm once again, unfortunately, going to ask you to project into the future. So, 5 years from now, a new government is elected by the by the people of India. It could be the NDA again. It could be the UPA. It could even be some party that doesn't even exist right now. Yes. Now, when those parties come to power in 5 years' time and they start either asserting or reasserting, depending on who's coming to power, their foreign policy, could you just give us a hypothetical?
Look, I think the next 5 years are going to be exciting no matter who is in power in both countries. India and Sri Lanka today are being driven by a young population, by a growth-oriented business community, and certainly by a sense of a projection of power in a way that we have not seen before. These are two countries that also now have governments that kind of match that, given that both governments have very, very strong mandates inside their countries. It would be a shame indeed if those strong mandates are not put to good use and not put to help out this very resurgent, very dynamic community in both countries. This is not something theoretical, I'm saying. India and Sri Lanka are going to have to cooperate in many ways, whether it comes to the infrastructure redevelopment inside Sri Lanka, whether it comes to, in fact, the idea that India is now hoping to open up much more to its neighbors when it comes to business, and whether in fact they are able to recognize that they are now part of a larger geopolitical situation, one where they are being watched very, very closely by two of the big world powers. Both China and the US have interests in this region. And whichever government comes to power in 5 years in India, as I said, I think it would be a huge loss if both India and Sri Lanka don't use these few years to build up the ties between them, to build up the kind of infrastructure that they owe their people. Really, I mean, this is something that you owe your populations. And if you don't use these years to understand how to best use your resources, which are a fast depleting resource. You know, the fish is only one part of it, the marines are only one part of it. There are so many other resources that both countries need to use much more wisely.
And with that, I guess we can bring an end to our conversation here. So, Ms. Haidar, thank you for your insight, your comments, and most importantly, your time. And thank you guys for listening. And once again, if you like our content, please give us a like or subscribe to our channel, or just tell whoever you know about us. That would really help us a lot. So hopefully this is the first in many conversations we have with policymakers and journalists all over the world on Asia. And yeah, thank you guys.
Good luck.